Good evening. I'm Richard Nago. This broadcast tonight will cover a subject rarely talked about on television or any medium for that matter, ourselves, specifically public media. This half hour will cover the current state of public broadcasting and where it can go from here in serving the public interest. Now I know that this subject is not an easy one to report on tonight because this is a reflection of what broadcasters like myself do on these airwaves, but it is an important topic of discussion. The truth of the matter is that without the informative, educational, and reflective qualities seen in various programs on public broadcasting, especially news and public affairs programs, America as a democratic society would not have survived and thrived as long as it is still doing right now. To be clear, this program is not about the work that BRIC is doing for Brooklyn viewers. Instead, this is about the respectable work that thousands of public radio and television stations nationwide that are affiliated with PBS and NPR are doing. There are two main reasons why I'm devoting attention to this subject tonight. First, public broadcasting has been alive and well for over 50 years now, and I'll explain how those origins came about in just a moment. And second, President Trump recently attempted to eliminate all federal funding for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, or CPB. If Congress allowed that to occur, PBS and NPR would lose significant financial support and stability because they would then have to rely on corporations, individual donors, or even foreign entities for sustainable programming. But luckily, that did not happen. Even so, there is still a fiscal debate in Congress about how to keep PBS and NPR stations on the air while still reducing the cost for government and maintaining the bottom lines of all Americans. So tonight, we'll look back at how this bold experiment began, how it fiscally sustains itself, and the recent defunding controversy. But the objective here is to prove why public broadcasting should still stay on the air for another 50 years and counting, as I'll highlight three categories that public media has made valuable contributions in news and public affairs, education, and the arts. We begin with looking back at the origins of American public broadcasting for a few moments. As best as we can tell, in terms of recorded history anyway, public television began in 1952. In November of that year, the Ford Foundation created the National Educational Television Network, or NET, which initially relied on programming made by local stations. Because of this, NET did not go on the air as a national network until May 16, 1954. Then, in 1967, public broadcasting as we know it finally began to take shape. On November 7th of that year, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Public Broadcasting Act into law, which helped establish the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in that same year, as well as PBS and NPR a few years later. The precedent made here was extraordinary because this legislation amended the Communications Act of 1934 to create a space, time, and platform for producing and distributing educational programming on non-commercial stations for both radio and television. After the historic signing, President Johnson said, "While we work every day to produce new goods and to create new wealth, we want most of all to enrich man's spirit. It will launch a major study of television's use in the nation's classrooms and their potential use throughout the world." There is a lot more to be said about the CPB because it is the financial backbone of this medium, but we'll get to that a bit later on. In 1970, NET was discontinued and taken off the air because its own creator, the Ford Foundation, withdrew funding from the network. As a result, the CPB created a successor, PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service. But NET didn't entirely disappear because it soon merged with a prominent local public television station here in New York City, WNDT Channel 13. After the merger, those call letters were changed to what is now WNET. This allowed NET programs like Washington Week and Sesame Street to keep airing on PBS today. Before we continue with public television and the CPB, let's also not forget that public radio is an integral part of this story too. The Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 fostered the creation of National Public Radio, or NPR, in 1971. NPR is designed to be a radio and multimedia news network. It was founded on February 26, 1970, and its very first broadcast on the airwaves was the premiere of its flagship program, All Things Considered, on May 3, 1971. As of January 2018, NPR has over 1,000 stations broadcasting its programming, and that alone has been heard by over 30 million listeners. But more than anything, NPR has 17 domestic newsrooms and 17 international newsrooms alone. And yet, just like PBS, NPR is an independent and private nonprofit organization, and both still rely on the funding of member stations and affiliates, corporate and individual donors, and yes, Uncle Sam. Given these circumstances, the work that NPR is still doing today is an example of a medium that can fulfill its potential. As for PBS, it has also reaped the benefits of continuing success in public broadcasting. PBS currently has 350 member stations in all 50 states and 4 U.S. territories. There are nearly 200 million viewers nationwide. But most of all, a January 2017 survey ranked PBS as #1 in public trust, which is 42% of Americans surveyed. Commercial broadcast and cable television, online platforms, and newspapers are all behind in the pack. The one key thing that has been reiterated so far is that the entire public broadcasting system is independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit. The CPB is no exception. Although the CPB is the key source for federal funding, it is impossible for PBS and NPR to survive with that alone. At the national level, NPR receives just 9% of CPB funding. 37% of the money comes from individuals, 20% from corporations, 10% from foundations, 12% from colleges and universities, and 5% from federal, state, and local governments. PBS also receives funding from these sources as well, but there is one key difference. As a national television broadcaster, PBS mainly distributes programming produced by its local stations, which is why it receives the most funding from these stations, such as WNET here in New York. That money comes from the individual contributions of viewers like you. It's these unique circumstances that make public media a public-private partnership. Because the CPB was directly founded by an act of Congress, a key part of its funding comes from federal appropriations, which is just a technical way of describing how much money Congress gives to which sources for which purposes. As of the 2017 fiscal year, the CPB received $445 million in federal appropriations. As of today, more than 70% of that money goes to nearly 1,500 locally owned public radio and television stations. As the backbone of all public media in the U.S. today, these stations are especially vital for rural communities that have scarce access to mainstream commercial media in those parts of the country today. Because of the source of the funding, CPB neither produces programming nor owns any broadcast stations. Despite the fact that these stations rely on Congress to survive, our government has attempted to cut federal funding multiple times over the years, but the latest attempts have by far been the most concerning. For these 2 fiscal years in a row, 2018 and 2019, President Trump has recommended the elimination of the CPB. Without that substantial funding every year, local public television and radio stations would have to make austere cuts in programming and community resources. But the administration also wanted to eliminate funding for the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities in both instances. Those 2 organizations are critical in promoting and advancing education in the arts and humanities in our public schools and communities. Plus, both organizations are key sources of funding for arts and humanities programming on public media today. But what's even more frustrating about this situation than anything else is that all federal funding for public media is just 0.01% of the entire federal budget. I repeat, that is 0.01%, or 1/100th of 1%. And the CPB says that overall funding only costs $1.35 for each American taxpayer. And yet, as we're discussing this, there is costly spending on our military, foreign policy, and domestic entitlement programs. Why is it that this administration is cutting money for things that cost little to nothing and has no net gain or loss on the national debt, but yet keeps spending billions or trillions of dollars on major policy initiatives? Not only is that backward economics, but it also can't even meet the simple standard known as common sense. By cutting back on a vital part of American life that is incredibly cost-effective and affordable, this administration is risking the gradual erosion of a democratic and civil society that has defined our diversity, culture, and moral standing for so many generations. And as I mentioned earlier, rural communities whose local public media outlets are the only media sources they can count on will cripple mightily in that aspect. That is no exaggeration, especially when the entire public media system now reaches 98% of the U.S. population. The worst-case scenario of this would be that PBS and NPR don't receive funding from their local member stations, which is the #1 source of cash flow, and that money comes once again from the CPB and Congress. No money means no programming. No programming means no resources, and no resources means a loss in public service. The only substitute for federal funding would be contributions from viewers, but that is barely enough to make a difference. And foundations and corporations are not guaranteed to help either, because there isn't a contract that legally binds them and public broadcasting. As we speak, Congress is debating the amount of public media funding for the 2018 fiscal year. If public broadcasting is to financially survive for another 50 years, then the work it has achieved must be noteworthy and successful in the public interest. And so we look back now at the significant contributions public broadcasting has made in news and public affairs, education, and the arts. When it comes to journalism, it's more critical than ever to report on underreported issues that are deeply affecting the public, especially the underrepresented public, at a massive scale. If not, we have failed ourselves, our profession, and the public's trust. That is what makes public broadcasting a public service. Despite President Trump's recent defunding attempt, the CPB invested nearly $15 million in journalism produced by public media, which does not only include PBS and NPR. And when it comes to serving underserved communities, the CPB set up a structure of local and regional news organizations that work together with national producers to produce the maximal impact in news coverage. All public broadcasters have a moral obligation to be held accountable to the Public Media Code of Integrity, which keeps the same public service standards while evolving to new technologies. These standards were first written in April 2012. And of course, the CPB does give grants to journalistic collaborations in various newsrooms across the country. A notable and outstanding program that represents the heart of public media journalism is PBS's Frontline, an investigative documentary series. Since its debut in 1983, it has produced hundreds of news documentaries that tell stories in the impactful and compelling ways that uphold the standards I just outlined. A recent example is a 2017 film called Abacus Small Enough to Jail, which is the story of the only known bank in this entire country to have ever been indicted in crimes related to the 2008 financial crisis. Abacus Federal Savings Bank is owned and operated by the Sung family, and they're all committed to serving the Asian American community here in New York's Chinatown. Here's a preview.
Today, we are announcing the indictment of the Federal Savings Bank on mortgage fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy. A federally chartered bank that has been catering to the Chinese immigrant community since 1984.
If you were going to pick on a bank, a family-owned company, wedged between a couple of noodle shops in Chinatown, is about as easy a target as you could possibly pick.
When I was a lawyer, there was no bank owned by Chinese and serving the Chinese. When I walk around here, I feel very much at home. This is a very tasty noodle shop.
That's always special. That's the butt, isn't it the butt?
When we were children, my dad was excited about this bank he was going to start.
We serve people who've never even dealt with the banking system before. This whole ordeal began in 2009.
One of our loan officers stole money. He was lying all over the place. He was running a money laundering operation. I fired him that day.
They went straight to their regulator and they told them about it.
The DA's office started asking us questions.
Wait a minute, maybe we're the target.
If that prosecution goes through, that bank is going to go out of business.
Although this is David versus Goliath, they're a whole family of lawyers.
We spent a lot of time investigating and ended up absolutely convinced that the loan department was corrupt through and through.
They routinely falsified mortgage documents.
Reporters in this town were treated to this extraordinary photo opportunity, this almost Stalinist-looking chain gang.
Herded like cattle down the hallway. I've been doing this for 25 years, and I'd never seen that happen.
Mommy's worried. Papa's 80 years old. He's been up since 5:30 a.m. He has nothing to eat for dinner. Let's get you some food. Papa, you do.
This is how he is. He's very calm, and I'm like a jumping beans. I'm always running around.
You're gonna eat out. You're older than the man, okay? You're not a young kid anymore. The state is killing you.
Abacus Federal Savings Bank had one of the nation's lowest default rates, not the highest, one of the lowest. Frankly, if every bank had underwritten as well as Abacus, we wouldn't have had a financial crisis.
People get the wrong impression that Chinese are not law-abiding.
This case is an attack on our community. We're easy prey.
Too big to fail turns into small enough to jail, and Abacus is small enough to jail.
I must also add that this film was nominated by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences for an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in this year's Oscars, now in its 90th year. This is also the first Oscar nomination for Frontline, too. Another issue that cannot be overlooked in public media is education. Besides the numerous children's programs seen on the public airwaves over the years, there are two particular initiatives that are worth noting. First and foremost is PBS Learning Media, which is a wide array of free digital content that can be used for pre-K to 12 students and educators, and the diverse subjects covered can improve teaching and learning in the classroom. As of today, over 120,000 digital resources are available for all pre-K to 12 students and teachers on PBS Learning Media. Over 1.8 million educators and users have registered access to the website. But the most impactful results come from the standardized curriculums and assessments in classrooms everywhere. Research shows that students using digital content on PBS Learning Media have a 10% increase in scores on national assessments and an 11% increase at the state level. Plus, 56% of those students showed an increase in critical thinking skills, which is a major bonus. This is a resource that will be relied on more than ever before in the generations to come, especially when education funding at all levels of government is not up to par with the needs of students. And second, the CPB founded American Graduate Let's Make It Happen in 2011. This is a unique partnership between the CPB, over 128 public broadcasters, and over 1,700 partners nationwide to help all students become ready for college and career development, and most of all, to end the high school dropout crisis. In this initiative, public forums and town halls are being held nationwide to discuss the problems and find the solutions. However, elementary and middle school students are also getting outreach with free access to resources on PBS Kids and PBS Learning Media. Between 2011 and 2016, access to resources on PBS Kids and PBS Learning Media. Between 2011 and 2016, over $17 million was raised by local stations to support this initiative, and over 21,000 hours of educational content has been produced for American Graduate. It's also important to mention that at-risk schools are also involved in American Graduate to make sure that more schools graduate and not drop out of school. And in the 6 years that American Graduate has been running, the CPB and most PBS stations nationwide have set aside a day each year to broadcast a day-long special called American Graduate Day, which highlights and recognizes the efforts and achievements made by all of the partners in this endeavor. More information is available on americangraduate.org. Last but not least, public media's efforts in raising awareness in the arts cannot be forgotten. Some examples of this include American Masters, which profiles famous artists in television, music, architecture, film, and dance, among others. American Epic profiles ordinary Americans whose journey from the unknown to the famous made them some of the greatest musicians and record artists in the 1920s, which is especially important because today's music was based on the work of our previous generations. Austin City Limits is a music festival that showcases great music and the artists behind them, past and present. The program is produced by KLRU, a PBS station in Austin, Texas, and is televised nationally. And of course, for those who want to save the best for last, there's Great Performances, which is the flagship performing arts series on PBS and is produced by WNET here in New York. Public broadcasting is another critical platform for the voices of musicians, dancers, artists, and onstage performers. At this point, there are three undoubtedly clear reasons why public broadcasting is so essential and integral in American life. The highly respectable quality of the programming garners the most viewers and listeners. The educational and informative substance of the content cannot be produced by mainstream commercial media, and all of these benefits garner trust, confidence, and support. Public broadcasting is truly a place for everyone to show the best of America. If you want to report the news because you truly believe in your heart that the public's lives and decisions will be impacted by what you have witnessed, public broadcasting is the place for you. If you want to have honest and enlightening conversations about the issues of our time, public broadcasting is the place for you. If you want to show your creative talents that can illuminate, enlighten, and inspire the world, public broadcasting is the place for you. If you want to tell stories of the past that can shape the future, public broadcasting is the place for you. And most of all, if you're young and want to learn for the promise of a brighter tomorrow, public broadcasting is the place for you. That is our broadcast for tonight. We leave you now with the words of one legendary American journalist that convey the message of tonight's broadcast. It was September 16, 1962, and Edward R. Murrow anchored the very first broadcast of the brand new public television station here in New York City and the tri-state area, WNET. Keep in mind, though, that before 1970, it was called WNDT. We thank you for watching Brooklyn Free Speech. I'm Richard Niguel. Good night and good luck.
Good evening. I'm Ed Murrow, and this is Channel 13, WNDT, something rather different. But in the words of Dylan Thomas, to begin at the beginning, this is educational television. It is 9 years old, quite young in the annals of education. But then television itself is but new come to being. This afternoon, there were 67 stations in the country. Tonight, this becomes the 68th. In time, there will be over 200 such stations. It will, in short, be the development of a new fourth television network, serving all the peoples of the 50 states that are this land. Educational television is non-profit. Upon these airwaves, you will see no commercials. The only thing this channel will sell is the lure of learning. The only product they will push is the node of knowledge. The price you will pay now is the time you will invest to listen and to see. Though this channel will be educational, I am assured it will not be dull. It will, for part of its broadcast day, help teach the teachers to teach. But the real function of this station will be to cover the province of all mankind. You will find humor here and entertainment, and you will also find news. If they occasionally bring laughter to your lips, I trust they will on occasion bring a tear to your eye. Impressions and enlightenment as varied and as vital as is all the activity of humanity. Some of this product is already in existence. Of much of it, they can be very proud. Tonight, later in this premiere, they would show you some of their product. I occupy this chair as a host, solely by invitation and perhaps because I had one blue shirt left. I have spent many of my working years in commercial television. Commercial television did not completely fill the promise of this medium. That is the reason educational television was conceived. But commercial television has been too little recognized for the good things they both did and are doing. Educational television comes into existence not because commercial television has failed, but because commercial television is confined in what it can do.